Hey everybody, welcome to Abstract Watercolor Fruit and Floral. My name's April Knight and I lead Scripturedoodle and Well-Crafted Retreats, where we are all about helping people engage with God in a creative way. Today I'm going to teach you a fun intro class to abstract watercolor with some fruit and some floral. This is a beginner level class, so you don't have to be a pro. You don't even have to feel capable in the creative department. I'm just here to help you have fun and teach you a little bit. So let's get started and see what is inside our kit. All right, so if you have this kit for the class, you have these great worksheets that go along with the class with some tips and some floral and fruit inspiration. And you have our favorite Pigma Micron 08. You have an 06 round brush that's a little more new than the one I'm going to be using. And then you have the best pencil in America, the Ticonderoga. We might not even use this that much, but just in case, we'll have it with us. You also have these two cards, which are going to be what we do our final projects on. And then you have a dot card of watercolor paints. Now, if you've taken our watercolor tips and tricks class, you have a different palette. You have this palette, which I use a lot. But for this class, I wanted to offer you something a little different. So these watercolors on your dot card are liquid watercolors. They come in a tube. Now they are dried, but the cool thing about the watercolors is you can add water and you can kind of reignite the paint. So that's what you have on this dot card. And they come from a liquid paint. So if you end up really liking these, you can check out these at your local art store. These are Artist Loft. You can find them at Michael's, and they're a great intro level watercolor paint. Now I want to show you, if you look at your dot card, you do not have words written on them. Now if you want to label them, you can. It's not necessary, but if you think you might forget where they are, you can go ahead and grab your pencil and label them as I tell you what they are. If you put the bright yellow at the top left corner of your page, then you will have them in order. The first is lemon yellow. So you can write lemon yellow on there if you want. Next to that, there is yellow ochre right here in the middle. And then you have a burnt umber right here. This is a brown, a dark brown color. And then right here is vermilion. It's like a bright red, almost slight on the orange side of the color. And then you have crimson. This is a deep red. This is the color you're going to use if you're wanting to lean more towards the violet side of things. And then you have a violet, just a true violet here. And then down on this 1, 2, 3, third row, you have a viridian. This is like a nice rich green. And then here on this middle, you have a cobalt blue. This is a lighter blue, and we'll use that for our lavender. And then you have this Prussian blue. This Prussian blue is a very dark, almost like a navy color. And then you have a bright pink that you'll use some for our strawberries and maybe our poppies. And then this last one in the middle is orange. And then on this bottom last corner, you have a mauve. It's like a rich, deep, reddish purple tone. It's very lovely. So I know that was a quick description of your paints, but those are the colors you have. You can jot those down. Not necessary to have to, just so you know about where the colors are on your dot card. Now you also want to grab a little dish of water. I love the little Pyrex dishes. And if you're at home and you have space, you could get 2 of those out, so you don't have to change your water throughout. And then a plastic plate or a paper plate. I'm going to be using this palette paper. It's like a plasticky paper to mix on. So we're going to do some mixing with that. So you want to have that along with you. So go ahead and pause the video if you don't have that with you. And then I want to show you some inspiration of the type of fruit and floral we're going to do. Then I'm going to, you'll get to know your brush. We're going to do some brush exercises. We're going to talk a little bit about the color wheel, and then we're going to get started with our florals. So let's check out the samples of the work. Okay, first things first, the abstract floral. Now, the cool thing about these is it is literally so simple to do. It's so hard to mess up. Here's a big page of ones that I've done where you can see I have these washes in the background, and I have similar tones here of the pink and the dark red and the purpley tone, and then you can see that I've come over top of it with my micron pen with a few different greenery samples, which you have on the 4th page of your worksheets. You have these greenery inspirations, but I want you to also look at over here on the left. I have a couple flowers that I don't have really much detail on at all, but with this bottom stem, it just sort of suggests this idea of a flower. And that is one of the things I want to tell you about this. When it's abstract watercolor, abstract art, it's good to remind yourself that, you know, you're not having to create a perfectly detailed picture. You really are suggesting this idea of a flower, or suggesting this idea of a whimsical fruit. So just let that put you at ease, that as we make these splotches, as I've called them, because I don't know what else to call them, but these splotches that we're making, the goal is not to have this beautiful detailed flower, but to really just give you a suggestion of what it is to look like. So put yourself at ease there, and then I'm going to show you some others. So here's a little sample. You have these 2 cards with you that we're going to create at the very end, but these are just some examples that what you could create. Now, when we do this in order, we're going to start with a wash, which you see in this brown back here, or like this golden color that I use the ochre with. And then you're going to do your splotches. And I'm going to walk you through all this, but just to get your mind thinking about it. And then you would come back with your felt tip pen to add those pen and ink details. Now, I'm going to tell you this later, but it's important to remember, when you add these details with your pen, you're not going to do that till you know that your watercolor is completely dry, because if you do it when it's wet, it's going to ruin the pen, but it's also just not going to come through. So put that in your mind, and then I'm going to remind you in a little bit. Let's keep looking. All right, so here's a couple different examples. This is a sample that's definitely a little more abstracted. That wash on the bottom is just very small, and I have not used the felt tip pen at all for this, and that's totally fine too. That's an option. If you're not into that stark dark color, feel free to just roll with something simple like that. Here's a couple examples. This is like super sweet, simple. Though, since this one does not have a wash on it like this, so that's something that you can decide what you want to do. But you know, as you look at these petals, they really are just suggesting which way the flower is going. Up here on the left, you see this flower is sort of facing up to the sun in the left. This one's going out to the right. And as we practice our splotches in a few minutes, those are all things we're going to think through and kind of practice. And then you have this one. You can see in all of these, I'm using similar colors. So I've got this sort of like blue family, and then this red and violet, and then red, orange, yellow. That's important when you're using watercolors and you're mixing and blending colors together, to make sure that you're using colors that blend well, which we're going to talk about in a second. But if you look at your color wheel on the front of your page, you see red, orange, yellow, green, blue, violet, and I give a note that talks about similar colors are going to blend well together. So keep that in mind as we do our splotches. You're not going to want to have a blue flower and then add orange details, because it is going to make a puddle of brown and it will be quite ugly, but we're not going to do that. So that's just a tip on the color wheel, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. Okay, so I want to show you some fruit examples now, which I was super excited about. I almost only did floral for this class, but I love fruit so much, and these are so simple to make, and you're gonna get to make a fruit card and a floral card, or you can just do both of one. That's totally up to you. But these strawberries especially, we're going to start with these when we get to the floral because they're so simple and easy. And you can see when you have that abstract feel to something, when you're creating an abstract piece of artwork, you get this freedom to change the color and create a whimsical shape. You don't have to think a ton about highlight and shadow or placement or negative space or all those things, you know, that can stress out an artist if you're not into that realistic look. The abstract is fun and you kind of get a little bit more freedom. So that's why this class is so fun to do. All right, so then we have these lemons. And my goal for each fruit is to give you a couple views. So this, you can see you have a whole lemon and then a half a lemon. And then you see this little splatter. My goal is to teach you guys a tasteful splatter. So I think as a young, you know, I don't know, kid, teenager, that splatter art was so fun and exciting. I'm going to teach you a tasteful splatter, which kind of gives a fun element to abstract. So we'll get to that in a little bit. And then you have these peaches, and we're going to do 3 different views of the peach. And if you're worried you won't be able to do it, just don't worry, it's gonna be great. Now this, you can see I haven't used any of the felt tip pen. I wanted to give you options and to be able to see both. This is totally a preference as the artist. You can do whatever you choose here, but I will show you how to use the pen to kind of create that. Lastly, this little kiwi, the kiwi, you can see 2 different views. And this one with the dark, I actually used watercolor. I did not use the pen as I did for the lemon and the strawberry, but that's just to give you variety. You're welcome to do either. I think that was sitting about like that. Okay, so those are just some fun examples to get you inspired and get your mind moving on how you want to do it. We're going to get into talking a little bit more about the color wheel. So I just mentioned this, but I want to mention it again. Similar colors are going to blend and layer well together. So we're going to learn how to create a wash or a splotch for your petals. And then we're going to add probably a darker tone on the second layer. And then I'm going to teach you how to pull out highlights. So when you're creating something like this lemon, you know, one of the things you're going to do is you're going to pull out this light color here, and that's going to create your highlight. So I'm going to teach you how to do that. And then I'm going to teach you a wet on wet technique, which is a very fun way to get that sort of pool of color spreading out on your page, and then a wet on dry technique, which we're going to use both throughout. But when we pull out, you're going to use a dry brush when you're pulling out that pigment to create. Basically what you're doing is you're removing the paint off of the page in order to pull out that color and give yourself just a white highlight. You're going to use a dry brush for that. If your paint is already dry and you're pulling out a highlight, then you're going to want to use a wet brush. And we may practice both of those things. But pulling out or lifting out, you're going to use a wet brush if your paint is already dry. If your paint is wet, you're going to use a dry brush. So you're kind of using the opposite of what you have there. All right, when you are creating shadows, which we're not going to do a ton of shadows for this, but you want to use a color that's going to complement it. And with watercolors, sometimes it can be tricky to do that. So we're also going to use some analogous colors or colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. And I'm going to walk you through that by using your dark card as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and make some splotches. You have 2 pieces of watercolor paper in your kit, in the back of your kit. So what we're going to do for these first 2 bits is we're just going to do some practice on watercolor paper. And you're going to get your dot card out. Now your dot card is dry. These are actually wet paints only because I didn't have another dry dot card. But when you are using these, my best tip is to mix on your paper plate or mix on your palette paper. If you have palette paper like this or a plastic plate, or really you could even work on a regular piece of paper, because if you mix on the card, which is really kind of what I often do if I'm working in acrylics or something, you're risking like muddying these tones, and because you don't have a bunch of tubes at home, you're gonna lift off your color from the dot and put it onto your palette, which is gonna be a paper plate or your palette paper, etc. Okay, so let's get started making a couple washes or splotches. So the first one I'm going to teach you is, I'm just going to give you some little inspiration here. The first one I'm going to teach you is the wet on wet technique. So however you do that is you're going to take your water. Let me scoot this in here so you can see. All right, so you're going to take your water and you're going to get your paintbrush wet. Now, you probably can't really see this on the camera, but what you're doing is you're creating a wet puddle here. Yeah, I know you can't see this. So actually, I think I'll make a tiny little color on mine. I'm pulling a tiny bit of color because I want you to be able to see, but you're going to make a puddle of no pigment, but I'm putting a little pigment on mine so you can see it. Now, when you're using, my favorite way, I'm right-handed, so if you're left-handed, you're going to do it like this. My favorite way to kind of create these splotches is to use the side of my brush. Now, I didn't really review this yet, but when you're using your brush, you're holding it like a pencil, slightly up the handle, and the best way to get these sort of splotches, and you can see I'm kind of, if you watch my brush, I'm kind of like, I'm using the side of the brush with not heavy pressure, but more pressure than if I was making a thin line. I'm kind of pushing it around. I'm using the end of the brush to create these sort of edges of my flower. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but make your splotch of clear, of just water, and then you're going to choose a color. I would suggest choosing, now you can choose any color for this, but I'm going to choose this red color. Now, your paint is dry, so here, I'll even show you a little bit. So you're gonna get your paint wet. The more water you put on here, the more it's gonna lift off that paint and really get it going, get it wet, get a good lather on it. And then you're gonna move it to your water and dip it in your water a little bit. And then you're going to put it on your splotch and you're going to watch it sort of spread out in a puddle. Now, if your wet splotch of just water is still wet, which it should be, you're going to see it sort of pool out almost like a puddle of water, like when you put ink into a cup of water or something, it's going to pool out. And you can see this sort of splotch. Simple. I love having these sort of rough edges to the splotches that I make. Like I can already tell this would be a nice little poppy splotch. Now, you're going to see that probably on yours, it's darker in one section and it's lighter on another section, and that is totally fine. That actually adds a nice dimension. And you can see on this of my example piece, you can see that on this one, that happened naturally, and it was really kind of beautiful because it created this like lighter petal pattern up on the top. And on the bottom, you have that darker pink color. So that's lovely. And I know we're not making a flower yet, but that's a splotch. Now we're going to practice adding another tone. So we're using a similar tone right now. So I am going to use a darker tone. So I'm going to pull some of this crimson, this dark red. And because I'm not mixing it, I don't really have to pull it over to my palette. But I'm going to use this dark red. I'm going to get my paint brush back in the water, and then I'm going to set it just down on here, and I'm going to see what happens. Now it's dark, the water is still wet, and I'm kind of with very light pressure moving around, moving it around, I'm pushing it around, and it's creating a sort of color puddle. Okay, now with this puddle, splotch, for lack of a better term, it really has, a darker tone in the middle. All right, so what we're going to try next is we're going to try something like this one. And our goal is going to be to have the dark on the bottom of the splotch, because that will give you an option for when you're creating your final piece to have some flowers that are round and head on and some flowers that are turning outward or looking upward, etc. All right, so now that you have your center splotch that is, I'm sure, lovely, let's rinse our brushes out and we're gonna move to another color. I'm gonna use this mauve color down here that you have that I really like. So you're gonna get your mauve, and this one of my mauve is dry, so I'm gonna show you what that means. You get your paintbrush wet and you move to your color and you move it around a little bit. Get a good lather on that. You can see how this, if you've used the palettes before, it's a little different, but for you, with this being dry, it is a little bit similar. So you just have to add more. The more water you add, obviously it's going to kind of get a lather and get more liquidy. So if you're getting frustrated, you just need to add a little bit more water. Now, too much water is okay for something like this, but when you're working on your fruit or something, or adding, like for example, when we add those details to the kiwi, we're going to want to make sure we don't have too much water on our brush, and I will talk you through how to do that. Okay, so this time what we just did was a wet on wet, where you start with a wet puddle of just water and then you add pigment, and then we added a darker tone on top to kind of create that darker center. Now, I'm not going to get ahead of myself. Let's do this one, and then I'm going to show you how to layer on more. All right, so right now we're going to try wet on dry. So we have a dry surface, and we have a brush that's full of that mauve color, and it's wet. My brush is pretty full. If you're concerned that you don't have enough water on your brush, just dab the edge of it very slightly in that water bowl and grab a little bit more till you know that you've got enough on there. Now, for this one, this is the shape we're hoping to make, something like this. So we're going to start with our brush. We're going to use the tip of our brush to our advantage, and we're going to come out with like a gentle sort of V. So we're going to come out on this side, coming upwards, sort of like that. And you can see I'm using the edge of my brush. So use the tip of your brush to your advantage. Now I have my hand sort of up this way, and I'm using the tip of my brush to go upwards in a V, kind of like that. Okay, now you probably saw how the paint went on the page very different. When you're using that wet on dry, there's a couple of things. You have more control because you have a dry paper, so that paper is soaking up the paint quickly. When you're using the wet on wet, it has a really cool effect, and it has that sort of like puddly swirl of color. When you're doing wet on dry, you don't get that, but you get a little bit more control. So I'm going to show you how to spread out this mauve color to get that ombre blend on your flower. All right, so here we have, by the time I've been done talking, this has probably dried up a good bit. So what I'm going to do is, I still have a little bit of this on my brush and I have it on my page, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to dab my brush in this water, and I am going to, with the tip of my brush, pull out this color. Now, I can tell I have too much water on my brush to really pull it out and lighten the color. So I'm going to dab my brush on my paper towel. So if that's you, go ahead and dab that brush on your paper towel. And then I have mostly an empty brush with a little bit of pigment on it. So now I'm going to pull out that color, kind of pulling it out. And I'm going to dry my brush off again because I have still too much. Now I'm going to come for some water, just water with no pigment on it, and I'm going to sort of fill that in up top. Now you may be seeing, like what I'm seeing, I'm getting a little bit of that fade of color. Perhaps you can see that. But in my mind, I'm thinking, man, I feel like that's not dark enough. I want like a darker base. Now, when I did this one, I used all the same color, but we're going to practice adding a bit of a shadow color with another tone. So here I have options. All right, I have the mauve. So what I can do with the mauve is I can have a richer pigment, so I can get a darker blend of this color, or I can use my violet, or I could try the crimson. The crimson has a bit of a dark tone, so maybe I'm not going to try that. So I think what I'm going to try is my violet. So if you want to try that too, go ahead and dab your brush on the edge of that violet till you get the violet moving. And then you can even come back to the to the mauve if you want to make sure it's on the same sort of family. Then I'm going to take my violet and I'm going to pull upwards with my brush to add a darker tone. Now, ideally, I'm waiting till this is a little more dry, which we may come back to. Let's come back to that in a minute and see if we can get it even darker. You can see because my paint here on my sort of upward looking splotch was still a little bit wet. It was pooling, P-O-O-L, pooling a little bit because it was wet. It kind of had that wet on wet effect to it. Now, if it were all the way dry, it would have a more stark look to it because it would be going on to dry. So that's, you know, when you're layering and you're really wanting to get that darker shadow or overlay color, if you get frustrated because you can't get it dark enough, you need to wait. You need to let it dry, and then you're going to get that dark tone with it. So let's come back to this guy. I want to see if it's not even really quite dry either, but I want to practice kind of adding a darker center to this splotch. So I'm going to come over here to my crimson. That's a similar color. And if I wanted it to be even darker, my options are maybe adding a little bit of this brown to it, the burnt umber, but then you're going to have a really earthy tone to it. This is already an earthy tone. So I'm just going to have this crimson and see. Now I'm going into the center because my goal with this flower is to have a dark center. So I'm pulling out. Yeah, and this is still wet, which is actually kind of cool. Yours is probably still wet. And I'm coming around here with a splotch of this dark. Can you see that? Now, it sort of had that bleeding out. That's bad to say when you're using red, but it's kind of pulling out around that center. And I've also kind of left the center open, which I was making it flower. If I was making a flower, I would have the option to create a center, or I could do that with paint if I wanted. But you can see that's the goal of having that dark center of this splotch. It kind of echoes and sort of imitates that flower. Remember, with abstract watercolor, we're just imitating, we're just suggesting this flower shape. It doesn't have to be perfect, etc. Let's try one more shape, if you will. And I'm going to use, I think I'm going to try orange this time. So you have an orange down here on the bottom. And our goal with this one is to, and let's use our pencil just for the sake of those of you who, if you're doing this and you're feeling stressed about the shape being perfect, just know it doesn't have to be perfect. And really, if you look at some of the ones I did, like for example, these, like they literally do not even look like flowers. And even if you look where I drew my felt tip pen, I even went on the exterior of it just to have this whimsical look. So it doesn't have to be directly on. Your splotch could look different, and then you have your flower over top of it, and it just has that whimsical look to it. So let's use our pencil, and we're gonna kind of create, our goal for this one is gonna be to make a flower kind of like this, or a splotch, excuse me. We're not making flowers yet. We still have time to learn. So we're gonna try to make a splotch that's looking this way, so that you have another flower option. So really we're having a flower that is looking facing front. We're having a splotch flower that's facing upward, and then we're gonna have a splotch flower that's facing to the right. Now, let's give ourselves a bit of a guide, very light. You probably can't even see this. I'm gonna draw a little darker for you so you can see, but I'm coming out with this line, and my goal is to kind of create, I'm just doing it open. I'm not even creating the edge, because I'm here to give myself a guideline to know that the point of my splotch is going to be on this left, and then I'm going to try to make a little bit of petals, more so than I did before. So let's take that orange. Now, if your orange is dry, you're going to get that get a good lather on your brush. The more water you add, the more liquefied your paint is going to be. And for this one, I already know I'm going to try and add some yellow on the outside. So we're doing wet on wet again, wet on dry again. And then for the last one, I'm going to show you a wet on wet. Okay, so we're going to start here with the tip of our brush. Use your brush to your advantage. You have pigment on your brush and you have water on your brush, and you're going to press down and you're sort of like scooting your brush across, like a shimmy almost. I'm not using that. I'm using the side because the more side you use, you get this sort of rough edge on this side. So this is the top upward, and then I'm going to come down here, and I'm following this line I've already made, and it almost is like a C. And then I'm going to come back. Now, I know this is a strong color, so orange is definitely a stronger color than your yellow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rinse my brush out and try to get most of the orange off of my brush. Then I'm going to come and I'm going to pull out a little yellow. Now yellow, be careful because your yellow can get muddy really quick. So I'm picking up this yellow and I'm moving to a different section to mix on. So this is where you're going to grab your plate or something so you can have a safe mixing zone, because if that gets into blue or green, you're not going to have the integrity of that yellow. So now that I have the yellow I'm looking for over here, I'm going to dab my brush in my water just a tad with the paint on my brush, and I'm going to come over here to the orange. Now I've been talking so long that this has started to dry, which is fine, but you can see as I rub my brush across this, it's sort of lifting off that orange and it's giving it a good blend. So if you're coming in with a highlight color like a yellow, this sort of looks like a Pac-Man, that's so funny. With a yellow, or you're coming into a layer that's already dry, you can sometimes push that around. You can see, watch this like circular motion. I'm just sort of pushing my brush around to lift up that orange so that you don't have a hard line. Okay, so now, and if it's like, if you saw that and you're like, I don't know, I don't like that splotch, you have an option. Okay, let's add another petal here. I'm going to come back to my orange that is mostly wet and add a little bit of water. And I'm going to use my brush to pull up another petal. I'm keeping this spot here, but I'm pulling up another petal. I'm pressing down hard on my brush, which you can't really see. And I'm just sort of twisting it around to see what I get. And that kind of worked, right? So pulling up, this is just practice. So please, even as I'm talking, if you're like, she's going so slow, just keep practicing, keep playing around. That brush technique, when you mix your, mix your brush around, you're really just wanting to move it, practice pushing it around and seeing what you like, what kind of shapes you can get. Let the bristles work to your advantage. Let them sort of do their thing and give those rough edges. The more you push it out and around, you're going to get those rough edges. All right, so we have 3 different splotch, but these are the whole goal of these is that they can become flowers. So we have 3 different splotches and 3 different colors. Things you see on all of them, you see a highlight shape, you see a rough abstracted shape, you see a darker center, or you have a different blend of colors. Like this is all reds, but then you have a red and or orange and yellow here, and this is 2 different violets. Now if I wanted to, I could try, let's just see for the sake of fun, if we can add some of this blue and if it helps or harms it. So this Prussian blue is very dark. It's almost like a navy. Now, when I talked about using similar colors to blend well, violet is like special because it can go, well, they can all kind of move, all the secondary colors can move to one side or the other on the primary. But for violet, you have an option to move to red, or you have an option to move to blue, because those are the colors that are next to it on the color wheel. Same with orange, you can move towards red or you can move towards yellow. The only ones you don't want to move are the complements. So yellow to purple, purple to yellow, blue to orange, red to green. They're good for shadow colors and acrylics, but for this type of project, it's no good. All right, let's see if we can add some sort of blue. Now this is all dry for the most part. So I'm gonna come in with my wet brush and see if I can get just a tiny little dark shadow underneath. Now, you can see I'm just lining the edge that's already there. I'm not creating anything new. And you can see I'm using the tip of my brush. And one of the ways I'm really using this, I'm pulling my brush outward. I'm pulling it out. Different than moving my bristle how I would if I was trying to make a detailed line, if I were painting in a different way. But for this, I'm really just pulling around. Now, for this blue, I kind of like the way it looks, and I'm deciding I'm not going to blend this. So your options here would be to get some water back on your brush and blend the purple and blue into each other, blend the blue into the purple. But I don't know, I kind of like the way that it's a stark difference. And I may even add some petals with the light pressure of my brush. But you definitely don't have to do. A lot of these details we're going to add. See, I'm just using the tip of my brush here, and I'm making squiggle lines very slowly up and down, up and down, up and down. That's a good thing to practice if you want to add detail. I'm using the very tip of my brush. So light pressure. When you're creating a really thin line on your brush, with your brush, you're going to use light pressure, barely, just the tip of the bristle, and that's going to give you that thin line. If your hands are shaky, you can anchor your hand on your wrist or your pinky, something like that. But that's sort of some brush practice that you can spend a little time doing. Now, and if you're watching this video and you're like, I love that, but I need time to practice, just pause the video and do some practice on your splotches. Do some practice on your brush technique with your thin brushes and your thick strokes and your thin strokes. Give yourself some practice. Feel free to pause that. Okay, that's our splotch practice. I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope you had some fun. Remember that wet on wet is going to pull and sort of like swirl around on the paper, and the wet on dry you have a little bit more control, but you can still blend those colors together. So now I want to do some, that was sort of our poppies practice, and you can refer to your worksheets to see those poppy details and like a step-by-step. Your first step is the wash. Your second step is adding those colors, those details like we just did. And then your third step and fourth step would be just taking that felt tip pen and adding details, which you can refer to on page 4 of your worksheets. I have extensive examples on the felt tip pen. Remember, I'm not going to do that right now because it's not dry all the way, but at the end I'll come back and we'll add some stems and greenery to these little poppy splotches. Then you can put your final on your card when you're ready. But I want to keep moving, and I want to do a little lavender tutorial, and then we're going to move into a quick greenery tutorial, which is actually very simple. A lot of these cards, like you can see on this one, really most of these don't have much greenery at all. They're just simple lines to just have that kind of minimal look to them. But I do have some greenery samples that we'll do after the lavender, but I want to jump into this lavender because it's a sweet little whimsical abstract. So here is an example of lavender that we're going to practice. I want you to sort of see the steps. Now, if I were going to do lavender on a card, I would start with a simple wash like this. And this, this is where you have that tasteful splatter. So I'm going to show you that. And then you're going to have, this would be your next step, sort of like this. So here I have, this would be your next step. Once this was dry, you could come over it with your stems, and you can see I have 3 lines. We're going to do this in a moment, but I'm just kind of prepping you. Then you're going to have this section, which is you're going to add a light color of the violet and or that cobalt blue. And then once that's dry, you're going to come back with a darker tone of violet for that the details of the lavender and the bow if you want. Now, you can see, like I said, this just sort of, it just suggests this idea of lavender. There's not a lot of detail. You don't have to put any pen and ink. You can just use it as like a sort of a soft, when you're using that felt tip pen, you get, it makes it a bit more like poppy and kind of fun. That sort of line and wash is what it's called. But with that, if you're just using a wash of the colors, the watercolor, it sort of has a more like gentle, soft tone. So that's the option. Both can be abstract, both can be beautiful. It's just kind of what you prefer. So let's practice that lavender. I'm going to set this up here. All right, so first thing I'm going to do is we're going to get our green. So you're going to use now, if you have 2 waters going, you may choose to have one for your blues and red, or blues and greens, one for your reds. I'm going to try to do that so I don't get muddy water, or you can just pause and refill your water. So first things first, let's kind of practice this wash because we didn't really do that. So you can see on my sample of this flower, I have this sort of like mustardy wash that would go behind. That's kind of what I was thinking when I created this. You certainly don't have to do that if you're a more neat and tidy gal. But so let's kind of practice that. How you're going to do that, the keys are going to be getting that water on your brush and using a lot of water to create a light tone. So the more water you add with watercolor, the lighter your color gets. I'm using this cobalt. I'm also going to come over to this violet and take a little chunk over here to play with. I want to make sure it's not too dark, and so I'm going to test it on my page before, and I can see that's pretty nice and light, so that will work. Now that I know the color I want, I'm going to get a little bit more because I want to make sure I have enough. So for this wash, you can do a wet on wet. You can do a wet on dry. I'm going to start with a wet on dry, and then I'm going to show you the difference. All right, so let me scooch out of here. I'm going to give you a free spot. All right, so I'm going to take the side of my brush, and same thing, I'm really kind of pushing it around. You can see I have it's anchored to the table, and I'm just sort of pushing this around. This is wet on dry, so I'm just sort of creating this abstracted shape with this one color. Now, if I wanted to add, you can see on my original, I actually have two colors here. I have the cobalt blue with a little bit of the darker blue in it, and then I have this cobalt and the lavender mixed together. If you wanted to add a little variety here, you can take some water, and let's try add a little wet on wet wash. So on this side, I'm just going to do a puddle of water, and I'm trying to create some little abstract edges by pushing it around. Doesn't have to be anything in particular, but I'm just kind of pushing this sort of abstract shape. It makes me think of those ink dye things that you look at in psychology. So then I'm going to have this wet. I'm going to make sure this is really wet. I'm going to come back with my, let's see, a little bit of violet, and I'm going to put it on here. It's going to sort of pool around. Now you can see I'm kind of rolling my brush around. If you watch how I'm rolling it around like this, I'm rotating it, I'm spinning it in my hand. And that is kind of, I love to do that when I'm doing abstract because it is kind of like, you never know where the pen's going to go. You never know where the water's going to go. And I kind of like that. So I'm just rolling it around on my hand. And the cool thing about this shape and this abstract wash is that it's kind of echoing that the little petals of the lavender without really even noticing it. We're gonna practice a tasteful splatter. Okay, so we'll see how it goes. The key is a lot of water on your brush and a gentle sort of flicking of the brush. So I'm mixing. Actually, I might just kind of stick with this cobalt color, and I'm gonna put my brush back into the water until I can pull out enough of that cobalt, so I know my brush is full. And I'm mixing it around, and I know it's pretty full. Then I'm going to even dip more in the water because I want it extra full. And then I have my hand anchored under the table, and I'm just going to sort of tap. I'm going to sort of tap my brush, and you'll be able to tell like how much pressure you need. I'm just kind of tapping my brush on here. Now, what you'll notice is if you have, that might have been too much, but if you have a splotch that is wet still, you can see that this was kind of dry on here on this side, and this is a little wet right here. So it splattered, but it went away quickly, which is perfectly fine. That's just kind of the art of it. Now, right here, I'm dabbing a full brush on the edges of something that's already wet, and you can see it sort of pulls out like that, like P-O-O-L, pooling out like that, and that's great. So that's sort of just a little splotch that you can put on the background. Now, if you're going to do that on your card, you want that to dry thoroughly before you add your second layer, which would be your lavender. Let's get moving on our lavender. So you're going to take a little bit of your green, and if this is too poppy for you, what you can do is you can pull some yellow in. I'm going to pull a little bit of yellow into mine. Make sure that if you're pulling yellow into your green, you should actually do that first so that you don't have green in there. So pull a little bit of yellow off Mix it with some water, get it lather on there, and pull it to a new pot on your new spot on your palette you're mixing on. This palette paper is great. You can get it at Michael's. Okay, so then I'm going to pull a little bit of green, and I want my brush wet, but I don't want it too super wet because we're going to get a thin line. So if you think you have too much paint on your brush, dab it on your napkin, and then you're going to create 3 different lines here. All right, so we're going to start with one kind of in the center. You're using light pressure on your brush, coming down, and then we're going to have a line that is slightly lower, crossing like that. And then we're going to have one that's kind of in between. So you have a tall line here, you have a shorter line here, and then we're going to come somewhere in the middle, about right here, and we're going to cross in the middle. And then I'm going to rinse my brush out quite well. And then I'm going to pull to my cobalt, and I'm going to mix a little bit of lavender in. And remember, for this, my aim here is to have a tone about the same as my wash or slightly darker. So if I want it a little bit darker, remember lavender really has that purple tinge to it. So I'm mixing a slightly darker, and I am going to dab just little tick lines of lavender. Now lavender petals kind of can go up a little bit. I'll show you over here, and they kind of come down a little bit. Just these little shapes up and down. You want them pretty thin, nothing too heavy. And if you look, you can see I have tiny dots. I have longer splotches that come down. I'm using really light pressure here, and I'm kind of letting the brush do the work. And this, don't worry, this doesn't have to look like anything detailed because we're going to come back with that. But even then, we're just making these tiny little lavender bits. All right, I'm going to get a little bit more on my brush, and I'm going to come back to my third, and you want to leave a little stem of green on there, so make sure that you have enough. And I'm seeing this guy that I'm doing is really kind of heavier than I intended, so just know if that's you and it's doing more than you want, either color wise or splotch wise, no, you can come back. Now lavender can also have these little tails on the edge, so to speak, so you can come back and add some little tails out of it if you want. And then we're going to let that dry, and we're going to come back and we're going to do some more violet. Well, I guess we're not going to let it dry all the way, but we're going to come back to the let's just get just the violet. Swish it around, make sure you're getting it wet. And then remember, if you have too much paint on your brush, it's going to pool. We don't want it to pool. We're trying to create a kind of a detail. So this is going to be our topmost layer. And what you can see, I want to show you this one. You can see for my darker tones, I didn't do it over every spot. I have a couple darker sections down here and up here on the right. And then I have some lighter sections. And you can see they're just sort of like tick lines. And as I'm looking at this, I can tell I used a little bit of this mauve down here. So pull a little bit of your mauve in if you want a more rich tone. Right, so now that we have paint on our brush, we're going to come down and we're just really kind of putting little tick marks on top of the light blue and having a variety of like different shapes. I'm just using the tip of the brush. I'm just sorting and moving it around into little messy dots, really is all it is. Remember, you're just suggesting a flower. It doesn't have to be details. You can see if you're watching me do this that I'm not covering up all the blue, really just doing little dots, little tick lines on it. And there you have it. It's kind of just a sweet little lavender. It's abstract, it's simple. We're not adding any we're not adding any marker or felt tip pen, but I am going to come back with my bow, and I'm using this burnt umber and a little bit of that Prussian blue, and may even use some violet if I really needed to get a dark tone, but you can see I'm mixing away from my color, not on top. And I'm just going to draw a little bow. Here's my example, and it's going to be floppy, using the light pressure just the end of my brush. And then I'm going to use light pressure for this one. You can see I'm overlapping, and that's totally fine. And then I'm just going to have 2 little strands coming down, and they're 2 different lengths, which adds a little nice variety. The bows don't look exactly the same, but you're kind of showing the people that these lavenders are tied in a bow. Sweet little way. Okay, let's move on to our fruit. Are you having fun yet? Is anyone feeling stressed out? I hope you're not feeling stressed out. Just know we're just here to have fun. The strawberries we're going to start with are so fun and simple and easy. So now colors, remember with abstract, you can kind of choose what colors you want. So that's really fun for this one. In particular, the strawberries are really simple. And I'll show you the example and then we're going to get started. We are going to do probably wet on dry for this. So here's my examples, and you have those examples to refer to on your worksheets. But we're going to start, you can see, here's my really first samples. I'm going to use the brush just to create this sort of heart shape. And the best colors to use, now I actually don't have a wet pink because honestly, in planning, I realized we needed a brighter pink. So I'm going to use this pink, but you have your dry pink down here in this corner. So just know when I'm pulling from the palette, you're going to be pulling from this. Okay, so we have our colors, and we're going to use our water. Let me get this water in here. So get your red. So you can start with any color. We're going to do a yellow. We're going to do a dark purple. We're going to do a red. And just know that you can create it however you want. I'm going to use one of these for my cards and really just have a bunch of strawberries on it. So I'm going to start with this crimson and just see how it goes. All right, so I have a wet brush. I'm getting my paint wet, and then I'm going to dab back into the water. And for this, I'm pressing outward, sort of like this side of a heart. You can see me sort of rolling my brush there, and I'm coming down to a point. And I'm going to do about the same thing on the other side, pushing my brush around and coming back to a point. Now, these little rough edges are lovely for abstract. They don't have to be perfect. And then I'm going to fill it in. And then you can see how the paint is sort of pooling in that. That's just kind of lovely. And then one of the things that make these really fun, so this one can be, when you're creating your strawberries, you can have one that's really kind of flat, all the same color. You can create a shadow and a highlight. Let's try to create this sort of yellow one. So we're going to you have a couple options. You start with orange, and then you bring like this reddy vermilion. Actually, let's try with that. And we're going to bring the yellow in the middle. So let's start with that. We're going to get it wet on your paint. Come around to the left. And you can see, oh, that's really kind of light. I might need a little bit more. Come around on your left. If you're left-handed, you might be coming around on your right first, and that's fine. And then I'm going to come around to the other side. And you can see I'm really just making these little heart shapes. Now, some things that will add variety are making some that are lighter or darker or longer or fatter, shorter. You can see I have plenty of variety here. Then I'm going to come back with my yellow. Now, remember, I'm looking at this yellow and I can see it's going to get muddy. So I'm going to pull some yellow away, get it wet, and sort of pull it away to its own little section. I'm going to move over here to its own little section, and then I'm going to put it on my heart strawberry. and just see how it goes. Now, mine was kind of wet. This looks kind of funky, and I like it. Let's try a wet on wet strawberry just for kicks. Let's do that with the purple. So I'm going to use actually the mauve. So I'm going to start with my wet wash. So I'm just making a strawberry shape in water, which you can't see, but try to create that same sort of heart strawberry shape in water. And then I'm going to get my pull from my mauve, which I know strawberries aren't mauve, but you know what's really fun? These two colors together. So that's what I'm thinking. Complementary colors, yummy, they work so well. And then we're going to put our paint directly on this water wash that we've already created. And you're going to see it sort of pool and get a little wild. And the cool thing about the wet on wet wash is once you make it, you're kind of keeping the water in this sort of like play area. It won't go out of the wash because that's just how it works. So when you create that wash, you can just let that water pool, and then you can add your pigment, the watercolor, and it won't go anywhere else because it's not allowed to. I don't know how that works, but it doesn't. All right, so I see this, and I want to add a little bit of a darker tone. Now, I know this red really isn't darker, so I'm coming over to my crimson, and I might even come to my violet, because remember we use the mauve. And I'm going to come around onto the bottom left of this. I'm following the shape I've already made, and I'm putting this on the bottom left. And that's how I'm creating my shadow. I'm adding a darker tone to one side of the strawberry. And you can see this is all still really wet, and it will dry lovely. For now, this is how we go. Now we're going to add the green stems to these once it's dry. We may even tag team from our peach. And then let's do a tiny little green, because you know strawberries are a little green before they turn red and pink. I'm mixing this green and a little bit of yellow. I'm trying to create that super neon yellow that strawberries are. And this I'm going to do wet on wet, and wet on dry, and it's going to be smaller. And I can see, oh, this kind of looks like a dot. So I'm going to pull a little point down there, and then I'm going to do another one down here. If you see this and you're like, oh, that's too green, what are your options? Okay, your options are you can pull out some of that pigment. So you're doing that with a dry brush. I'm doing that with a dry brush, and I'm pushing through the wet water or the wet paint, and the brush soaks it up, and you're leaving an empty white space to then fix. That's a great tip to learn. All right, so then I'm going to come back. I'm rinsing my brush out, and I'm coming back with my yellow, just yellow. Just yellow. And I'm going to come on top, and I'm just putting that yellow. I really didn't even put very much water on my brush because this is already wet. So these are the strawberry shapes. And then we're going to come back to those, and we're going to add some stems in a minute. But let's move on to our peaches. The peaches are so lovely. And these have a more, I don't know, I want to say professional, like fancy. But let's put those over here. And these are very fun and honestly simpler than you would think. All right, we'll put them up here so you can see. First thing I'm going to start is with this left-hand side of the peach right here. And I'm going to use my orange. And I'm going to pull some water, put some water in there and really get it flowing. And I really want to have a little bit of yellow on here. I don't want to get it mixed in with my green. So I'm going to put my orange in its own little spot, which I kind of have it down here. But then I'm going to rinse my brush out, and I'm going to get it dry. Well, just, you want to take the orange out, and then I'm going to pull a little bit of yellow away from it. And I'm going to sort of mix into a bright orange, if you can see that. So now that I have my orange and my yellow, I'm trying to make this poppy sort of yellowy orange. All right, so this we're going to do wet on dry. So once you have your pigment how you want it, then you're going to come around here, and we're going to create this sort of pointed oval shape. So I'm going to come down. I'm pushing my brush around to a point. And then, so this is, you can see it's almost like a crescent moon, which is also the shape we're going to use when we do the inside of the peach and the slice of the peach. And we're going to come back around to the other side. and I'm giving a slight point to my peach. You can see that? Now you can see, like, I haven't added any details yet as far as darker colors, but we're gonna wait on that. I wanna get my shape right first. Things to note on this shape, it's coming down in that same sort of heart shape. And I'm gonna come back around with that same orange. If your paint is sort of drying, add a little bit of water. And I'm gonna leave a little space. You can see here on my peach, I'm leaving a little space. So I'm following with the edge of my brush around to a curve, and I'm kind of twisting my brush around. And then I'm gonna pull it slowly to an edge. And then I'm gonna fill in this line right here. All right, and I'm leaving that little light spot. Now, I've got, this is about all one color, but because it has an abstract feel, the colors are pooling around because it's all wet, and that's totally fine. Now, I'm gonna come back and I'm gonna try and add this peachy color, the reddish tone, and I'm gonna use, my brush is clean now, and I'm pulling out this crimson, and maybe a little bit of this brighter red, orangey type red, and I'm gonna come back around on top, and you can see how it's kind of pooling on top of there. Now, be careful, don't go down too far or you'll kind of lose all of your orange. You don't want to lose all the orange because peaches are mostly orange, but peaches do have that lovely sort of color change all around them, that rosy look. So that's perfectly fine to have. All right, so then we're gonna have a brown stem. Get your brown wet. And you're gonna use light pressure on your brush, and you might need to anchor your pinky, and you're just gonna do one thin line down to about right there. I'm not even touching the peach. All right, and here we're gonna do a little bit of greenery practice. So I want you to clean your brush out and get it clear. And so then you're gonna come to your green, and we're gonna practice making these little leaves. All right, so you can use the tip of your brush. Let's practice over here first before I wanna practice on the back of my peaches. All right, so the key is you're using light pressure as you begin for just the tip of that, and then you're pressing down. Watch me press down. And I'm using the side of my brush, and then I'm slowly lifting back up again to get another point, and that's the end of my greenery. I'm gonna add a little bit of a darker blue so I can show you a little better on the camera. Now that's a lot of blue, but maybe this is a blue peach. Maybe this is a blue peach leaf. I don't know, you can do that when you have abstract. All right, so let's try again. Now, if your brush is too full right now, it could pull and kind of look messy, which is kind of how mine is right now, but we'll just see how it goes. So I'm using light pressure, just the tip of the edge of the peach leaf, and then I'm pressing down, and I'm using the length of the brush to make that thick line, and then I'm lifting up slowly again to make that edge of that peach leaf. So you start light pressure, then you press down, and then you press back up in like a swift movement. So you can practice that a few times. If you press down too quick, you're gonna get something kind of like that. So you're gonna wanna start with light pressure, then as you get moving, light pressure, press down, and then lift up again to that thin line. So we're gonna do that for our peaches. And wherever you have them going is totally fine. I'm gonna start midway up, and I'm gonna light line and then push down, and then lift up again. And then I'm going to do one on this side, same light pressure, and then press down, and then lift off, and you're going to have that peach leaf. Okay, let's do a peach with the pit, and then we're going to move on, because I don't want it to go too long. All right, so we're going to take that light orangey yellow. So remember, pull some of that yellow over for yourself to your new section, and you're mixing that. See, I already can tell I have green in my orange because I didn't rinse my brush well enough. So make sure you rinse your brush well enough. I'm gonna have this yellow. I'm coming down here. Yellow, and I'm a little bit of orange I'm pulling off. And I'm mixing this sort of like poppy orange color. And so this one I'm really not going to show you, but it's the same technique. You start with this side of your brush and you're pulling down to a sort of half moon shape. And then you're lifting back up to about here, and then you're going to lift up. And you can see I have this little tail, so I'm going to kind of fill that in. But your goal is to leave a sort of shape in the middle where we're going to draw that pit. So this is one side of your peach. And if you don't like the way your peach looks, like if it looks too much like the slice, your options are to fix and sort of correct that round edge. And that's fine. And I can tell that my peach, well, let's go ahead and do our other side, and then I'm going to lift off a little bit. So then I'm leaving this little line here, and I'm pressing down, and then I'm lifting back up again. And I'm leaving that little center for the pit. And you can see, not even on purpose, but this is a sort of lighter edge, which is, it's great because it kind of gives that natural highlight. So I'm going to put a little bit of that red crimson color for a thin line around the edge of my peach. So use your light pressure and go around a thin line around this edge of the peach. And probably it's still wet a little bit, so you're going to get a little bit of that pooling, which is cool. And then I'm going to come up here to kind of echo this, and I'm going to press down on that. And I'm going to give a little bit of a darker. Now, if you think you want to have some little lighter tones, which I really want to do, I'm going to rinse my brush out. And I'm going to add some yellow. This is that lemon yellow, so it's very bright. But I can tell, like right now, this brush has not that much water and a good bit of pigment. But I want it to be bright, so I'm just going to lay it right on that peach and see how it looks. Funky. It's maybe even lighter than I imagined. Okay, and then let's do a little bit of a pit. So rinse your brush out really good. You're going to come to this brown. And I'm going to put little dots. The cool thing about this is it doesn't have to be detailed. I'm pushing around this brown to make this sort of oval shape. And there's my peach pit. All right, let's come back to our strawberries and do some greenery on the strawberries, and then we're going to pause, and I'm going to talk you through creating your cards and adding some of that detail on with your markers, with your felt tip pen. All right, so I have my green. I'm going to do strawberry stems. Here's your inspiration for those strawberry stems. These stems are really hard to mess up. You're using that same greenery technique of the light pressure to start, press down, and then pull up again to kind of create that point on the end. Same thing, except they kind of get a little wonky. So you're going to start with a vertical stem coming out of each. 1, 2, 3, and they can be long, you know, they don't have to be. You can see how mine are going all kinds of different ways. But then I'm going to start with my edge and then press down and lift up. Press down and lift up. And strawberries, I think, have 5 stems. But you can see, like, some of them can come down and then lift up and turn. You might want to practice these. Light pressure, press down, and then lift back up. They don't have to look just like these, but your goal is to have a few different stems for each. And this purple one I did is still not dry, which is totally fine. It kind of pulls and gives it a fun little look. All right, and so then I'm going to do a few more for each of these. You can use really light pressure and get a really thin shape. which is great. And there you have it for that. So you can see that these strawberry stems and even these strawberry stems, they're not really detailed at all. They're mostly all one color. Where I get my detail for these is with that felt tip pen. And you can see we didn't even put seeds on the strawberries. We're going to use the pen for that once it's dry. Okay, so I know that was a lot of content, and I'm going to help you kind of like land the plane into your next steps. If you want to refer to your worksheets to have step-by-step on the lemon and the kiwi, you can do that as well. And then on the greenery on your worksheets, I just have a few different samples of greenery to do. Most of them, we're just going to use that stem for the poppies, which we're going to go into kind of putting those pen and ink details on the poppies, and then we're going to put the pen and ink details on the strawberries. But you have those cards, so be sure to think about, you know, you're going to make these sweet little cards, and I would do one fruit and one flower, and you can decide whether you want to do the lavender or the poppies or the strawberries or the peaches, or go after the lemons or the kiwi. But, you know, with each flower or fruit, those same techniques are gonna work. So you're gonna use that wash first, and then you're gonna add those details of a similar color to create darker tones. Like on the peach, we use that darker crimson. On the lemon, you're gonna use that darker golden. You know, my goal for you in this class is just that you get a taste and that you feel excited to keep practicing and keep moving on your process of abstract watercolor. So let's add a little bit of pen and ink detail to our flowers, and then we'll do that to the fruit, and then I will release you to put it on your cards and actually finish those up. So here is our splotch practice. Okay, so we are going to kind of echo these options of the greenery. So let's go ahead and give that a try. And then we're going to add we're just going to do quick little greeneries, and then we're going to add I'll add the pen and ink to these so you can have a sample and just know you can fill yours in when it's dry. So I'm going to take this green. So you can come back to your splotches that you made, or just watch and then keep this in mind when you create your postcards. You can add this type of greenery. So I'm just coming down with a thin line. I want to keep this inspiration there for us. Okay, so I'm coming down with one thin line. For this one right here, you're not going to see this under part of the stem because it's facing frontwards. All right, so just bringing a line down. For this guy that's upward, we're going to create a little sort of crescent shape coming up to the top. And these are also drawn on your greenery samples, so you can see I have 1, 2, 3, 4 little ticks. I'm going to add one up here too. And then I'm coming down with a very thin line. And then for this guy, I feel like we should make this a flower too, even though it's really simple and little. I want to be able to practice these. That greenery is going to have that same, you know, that thing we practiced with the peach. It's going to be the same concept, but we're going to use that as a thin line down here. And then for our long stems, we're going to take a thin, light pressure, thin line, and then you're going to start pressing down. And then you're going to lift back up to thin it out. And then you could leave just one stem if you want. That's kind of pretty. I think I'm going to leave that. And so for this, you know, I love these like little thin lines because they're just so simple and they're easy to do. Now, if you watched me do that, this flower is facing another way. So there's a slight curve here on that line, which is great. And then if you wanted, you could create little tick lines for yourself, which I talk about on the greenery and on the pen and ink page. I have examples of that. Give yourself these little tick lines for a guide. You know, anytime you're wanting to paint something, it's good to give yourself guidelines when you begin so that you have somewhere to go and you know where you're moving. So we're going to press down and back up, down and back up, down and back up. Same thing here, down, back up, down, back, up. I'm pressing down, I'm lifting off. Pressing down, lifting off, pressing down, lifting off, pressing down, lifting off, pressing down, lifting off. I know it's so repetitive, but that's kind of how it goes. So those are sort of your options of the splotches that you made. Now, if you want to take the time, you can obviously put them on a card and really make that finished look, if you will. All right. And then I've ruined my lavender, but all right, let's add some pen and ink details to these. Now, I want to show you the inspiration that we have. All my things. I'm putting all my things together. Okay, so I want to show you the inspiration and just know, you don't have to do this anyway, any certain way. There's so many options. If you look on your worksheets, I'll show you really quick. If you look on your worksheets, page 4, you have these adding details in ink where you see the buds and the loop flower and the lavender and a couple other examples of the stripes. And then you have these greenery samples down here. Oops. These greenery samples down here. Lots of different ways to add that pen and ink. Just the main thing is making sure that your watercolor is completely dry, which is why, you may just sit and watch me do this, and then once yours is dry, you can get after it. So I'm going to use this one as inspiration. And I'm going to practice a stripe like this with the little thin lines. And then I'm going to practice this loop flower. And then we'll do one of these that just has nothing on it. Okay. All right. So first things first, we're going to do a nothing flower. It's not a nothing. I'm making sure that's dry. And then actually I'm going to use this one that looks more dry. And I'm just kind of creating this black oval. And then I'm going to put little, I don't know, almost like a little swoop around, and then my pen. It's just going to follow that line down. Now, one of the things that you can see here is a lot of these I have just my pen line, and then I've drawn my greenery just with this pen and ink. So you can do that too. You don't have to have details in the watercolor. You can just do the pen and ink. So I just encourage you to refer to that page 4 of the worksheets and just decide what you like. It's nice to have a little bit of variety. So for this one, I'm gonna do my little thin lines stripe. So for this guy that we had looking up, I'm coming up around, and you can see these squiggly lines. I'm kind of following the lines that we created, coming back down, and I'm going to come down to there, to the end. And then I'm going to come up and back down. But I want you to notice my lines of my felt tip pen are not directly on, but that is I love that. It makes it more whimsical, makes it more abstracted. And you can see that I have this here as well. I have this loop flower overlapping the watercolor, and it's not perfectly lined, and that's great. All right, so I'm going to bring these thin lines down here, and you probably aren't doing this yet, or maybe yours are dry. So I'm bringing these thin lines down. They can be kind of wavy and follow the shape of the flower, and overlapping. All right, and then I'm going to take I'm just going to follow these squiggly lines on the edge of my flower and bringing this line down. And then for this guy, I'm going to practice that loop flower that is on page 4. It's going to kind of look like this. And the idea is you're coming out around and you're looping, you're doing a loop, and you're bringing it back to another petal. Same thing here, I'm going to do a loop, a little loop. I'm going to come back down, and I'm going to loop around again, and I'm going to come down. So you can see that is like so whimsical and little. It's not even following the shape of the flower, but it is a little bit, and that's kind of why I love it. You can also create some buds, which I show you on page 4 of the worksheets. All kinds of details on the pen and ink. section that you can mimic exactly. And that's probably a great way to start, trying to create exactly what I drew. Take it one little bit at a time, and then have a little freedom to just see. Maybe you want to kind of create your own lines and just test out different petal shapes and greenery leaf shapes and all that sort of thing. Let's head over to our strawberries, and we're going to add some details there as well. So let's do that now. Okay, so here is our strawberries. Here's our inspiration. Here's what we created in class. And so one of the things I want to make a note of is how my lines are not perfectly following the shapes of the strawberries. Like with our flowers, you have some open space around your flowers. And so we're going to do that as well. So, but the good news is we've already created the shapes and we're just kind of following along. So we're going to take around the edge of this little strawberry, and you can come just past. You can see I came just under that little green, and there's a little bit of white exposed, and it kind of gives it that simple, whimsical look. And I'm going to come up with my stem, and then I'm creating those simple shapes around the leaves. And then I'm going to do some little baby loopy dots. You know, a look of it, it's going to look kind of like that. A big look is like that, but you're going to make it a lot smaller. Little dots for your strawberry. And then we're going to come to these other guys as well. Up. And then make your little leaves. You can overlap them. Put some in front, some behind. And then these leaves we're covering. You're just really following what you've already created. You're going to come around. I do think when you're coming around to your strawberries, not following it exactly, you can even, like on this one, I overlapped on the outside of this strawberry and then on the inside on this side. And I'm going to create my little seeds. And I can tell this is barely dry. So just a word to the wise, don't be afraid to have a cup of coffee and take a break so that you can really cover up your stems. Little stem, and you can see how these look really cool, and they're super simple and they're not super detailed, which is what I love. So, you know, you have the examples of the lemon and the kiwi as well. The lemon and the kiwi are definitely a little bit more detailed, so follow those simple step-by-steps and just know as you go and as you practice, you're going to get better and you're going to get to be able to create more details. But, you know, for the strawberries, they're nice and simple. The peaches are pretty simple as well. And then if you decide you want to add those pen and ink details to the peach, you can certainly do that. You're following the edges that you already made, and you're kind of echoing the shapes. My hope is that this class has been fun and kind of exposed you to this idea of abstract florals. I will show you the overhead again so you can just kind of get a look at these examples and, you know, be inspired to create some for yourself using that wash and then your splotches, and then coming back finally with your felt tip pen to add details as you wish. So I hope this was fun for you. I hope you learned something, and I can't wait to see what you create. Please be sure to create something great and share it with us on social media so we can just celebrate you and cheer you on. I hope you like this class, and I hope you join us for another one soon. Thanks. We'll see you soon.